Hopefully you're here because you want to do a really deep dive into our cognitive biases and tendencies towards psychological misjudgment. We have divided them into 30 sections or tendencies and have done our best to make this a fairly complete collection. Please be sure to view the description for all the helpful resources and citations as well. Also, it is helpful to note that these biases are not all bad. Biases are basically shortcuts in our thinking, and they therefore allow us to spend less time thinking. We should, however, endeavor to do our best to be aware of them, because they can lead to some catastrophic blunders as well. So put on your learning cap and let's get ready to master our cognitive biases. Number 1, fairy tale dreams tendency, aka excessive optimism bias. Marco kept hearing reports of a deadly virus spreading around the world. News reports grew more and more bleak. However, he shrugged it off and stayed optimistic. A positive attitude should be enough to protect me from all this faint-hearted negativity, he told himself. When optimism goes from being a useful tool to a full-blown bias is when we can end up ignoring important information that does not conform to our rose-colored worldview. Sometimes the truth is not pleasant, and we need to change the way we act in light of information that may appear negative. We also may hold a view of a world where everything is fair and good and ignore information that does not fit into that viewpoint. This just world hypothesis can cause us to be biased into believing that only bad things happen to bad people, and we refuse to consider that the world may not be fair at all times. We can counteract this tendency by not ignoring discouraging information and by not finding fault with those who experience misfortune. If we can consider information rationally without leaning too much on hope alone, we can improve our judgment. Number 2, pathway to perdition tendency, aka excessive pessimism bias. Julia was following the news reports of a deadly virus spreading across the world. She knew it was only a matter of time before she got it and probably died. She hoarded as much food as she could get her hands on at the grocery store and scowled at anyone she heard coughing as she was certain that they were infected. She knew it was only a matter of time before society collapsed into complete anarchy after everyone's supplies ran out. Just as too much optimism can lead to unnecessary bias, so too can too much pessimism. A tendency to seize onto the negative view of a situation can create a negativity bias that disproportionately influences our thinking. We may overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes and ultimately make poor decisions compared with a more balanced viewpoint that takes into consideration both the positive and the negative. This negative inclination can even skew our view of the future, as can be seen in a tendency towards declinism thinking, where we remember the past as better than it was and expect the future to be worse than the evidence actually suggests that it will be. We know that fond fantasy is a dangerous path for rationality, and we now know that the darker pathway of pessimism also leads us astray. Balance, then, is clearly the rational approach. We should not suppress our views, but we should take note of whether we are overly pessimistic or optimistic, and appraise our discernment accordingly. Number 3, reward and punishment conditioning tendency. The iron rule of nature is, you get what you reward for. If you want ants to come, you put sugar on the floor. Charles Munger. Incentives are extremely important for influencing people's motivation to perform a task and can produce positive results as well as negative results depending on the situation. This is what the idea of operant conditioning teaches us, and it goes to show what gets positively reinforced gets repeated, and what is punished tends to be avoided, which then conditions future behavior. We need to make sure that we are reinforcing the right behavior and discouraging negative behavior, and that we are aware of this dynamic when making decisions. Number 4, bias from mere association. Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov discovered that if a bell was rung before feeding dogs, the dogs learned to associate the sound of the bell with being fed. The bell could then be rung without any food being present, and the dogs would still salivate as if there was food. The dogs had learned to associate the sound of the bell with being fed. Our brains can experience similar effects. Positive or negative stimulus can end up being associated with certain events, outcomes, or even people, such as in the case of Persian messenger syndrome, where in ancient times the messenger bearing bad news might have his life taken when telling the king the unwelcome information. In the eyes of the king, the messenger was so closely linked to the message that he must die, even if the reasoning may have only been subconscious. We need to learn to see past our positive or negative associations and instead judge based on the item's intrinsic merits. Number 5, self-interest and incentive bias. When archaeologists were looking for more fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they offered an incentive for locals to turn in any new fragments they may have found. They offered a reward for each new fragment. Unfortunately, this incentivized turning in as many fragments as possible, so people were breaking larger pieces into smaller fragments before turning them in to the archaeologists. People do what they believe is in their best interests, which can cause bias from those incentives. This can be observed in cases involving advisors, such as asking a salesman if you need their product, or following the advice of your stockbroker as he recommends yet another new trade. It was Benjamin Franklin who said, "Would you persuade? Speak of interest, not of reason." Which goes to show that when trying to persuade others, we would do best to focus on the other party's interests, such as money, status, reputation, etc. We should also be aware of situations where the same effect may be biasing our own thinking. Be aware of what is being incentivized and who stands to benefit, and how that may affect their motivations, the cause of which can vary all the way from money, prestige, status, and power, to avoiding things like social exclusion, embarrassment, shame, or guilt. Number 6, overly optimistic, self-serving tendency. There is a psychological principle or mental model called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where average performers reliably rate themselves as above average, which ultimately is not statistically accurate or possible, but it does go to show that people often experience an overly optimistic, self-serving bias when considering themselves and their own behavior. When we make mistakes or experience failure, we have a self-serving tendency to blame bad luck or external circumstances. However, when others make mistakes or experience failure, we often label them as foolish or unwise. The self-serving aspect of this bias can cause us to believe that our failures are due to external factors, and yet believe we are personally responsible for our successes. We may even be falling for the fundamental attribution error, where we judge others on their character, but we judge ourselves on the situation. This also may lead to a false confidence. The more we know about a subject or think we know, the more our over-optimism will cause us to be blinded to ideas outside of our own area of expertise. This is a good example of the Maslow's hammer mental model, where if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. We need to learn to recognize our limits and unreal expectations. Our expertise in one area may give us enough overconfidence to make mistakes that could be avoided by some humbleness and time spent learning many of the important big ideas from other disciplines. It is helpful to be aware of our tendency to overappraise ourselves and those close to us. We also need to keep in mind that we may have a self-serving tendency to believe that we are different and are not biased in our thinking. Number 7, self-deception and pain-avoiding denial. Alberto, a stubbornly proud college student who dislikes math, still has to take physics to earn his degree. He tries to pass his class repeatedly, only to receive very poor grades. He tells himself he's a smart guy, but perhaps he would be better suited to a liberal arts degree rather than seek help in the form of tutoring. He decides to avoid the pain to his ego of getting a tutor and thus deceives himself into choosing a new area of study with much less future market value. Richard Feynman, the notorious physicist, warned about self-deception in a 1974 Caltech commencement, where he said, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." We often have a tendency to deceive ourselves, especially if it helps us to avoid pain. There are many cases where people maintain the belief that lost loved ones are actually still alive, even in cases where the evidence is extremely dubious at best. It is just too uncomfortable to accept the truth in these circumstances, and so they choose pain-avoiding denial. We can also deceive ourselves by how we view ourselves. An aspect of self-deception involves the spotlight effect, where we overestimate how much people are noticing how we look and act. We deceive ourselves into thinking we are more important than we actually are to others, and rather than face this harsh truth, we often avoid the pain of its realization. Never lie to yourself, and also realize that you will probably try to deceive yourself. It is only natural to avoid pain and discomfort, but we should still strive to be aware when we are tempted to be biased through self-deception. Number 8, inconsistency avoidance tendency. Bob was researching his next stock investment and found what he believed to be a sure thing. He invested a nice chunk of savings into the stock and publicly encouraged his friends to invest as well. 6 months later, the stock was down over 50% from where he had first invested, but Bob adamantly declared that he was going to buy even more and that they should too. We tend to be most consistent when we have made effortful, deliberate, or public commitments. Warren Buffett stated it precisely when he said, "What the human being is best at doing is interpreting all new information so that their prior conclusions remain intact." After we have made a commitment, choice, promise, decision, or investment, we have a tendency to want to remain consistent so that we feel that we made the right decision. This consistency translates into our beliefs as well, in what is known as confirmation bias or belief bias, where we have a tendency to favor things that confirm our existing beliefs. Or in other words, we remain consistent with our pre-existing beliefs. Whether we are holding certain beliefs or trying to appear a certain way, we have a tendency to want to remain consistent to ourselves and those observing us. We would do well to remember Seneca's advice. There is nothing wrong with changing a plan when the situation has changed. Number 9, deprival bias. Bob bought a stock at $50 and proceeded to watch as the price began to move lower and lower. He stubbornly refused to sell and insisted that he wouldn't sell unless it came back up to around where he bought it. After all, I don't realize a loss unless I sell, he thought. Our judgment can become clouded when we are faced with the prospect of losing something we already have. Also, the amount of pleasure we receive from a $25 gain tends to be a different quantity than the amount of displeasure from a $25 loss. We perceive the intensity of the loss as exceeding the intensity of the gain. When we have paid a price, we may irrationally refuse to let it go, perhaps because of the pain of reversing the course of the sunk costs already involved. We even tend to value things we already possess just because we possess them. This deprival bias can even affect us when something is withheld or forbidden to us. We also want what we supposedly cannot have. The scarcity principle applies as we often want what is in limited supply rather than risk being deprived of the opportunity. We need to stay rational when considering situations involving loss or deprival. Does it really make sense for us to hang on to a losing trade or be manipulated into bidding on something just because it's in scarce supply? If you think you'll lose, take time to choose. Number 10, do nothing syndrome. Bob's credit card company sent him a letter detailing his ability to limit the personal information they would collect and share with advertisers. If he was okay with them sharing his personal information, he need not do anything. But if he wanted to limit the information, he was told he must send them a letter requesting the limitation. Bob decided it wasn't that big of a deal and might end up being a real hassle to change, so he decided against taking any action. We have a tendency to resist change and minimize our effort. The more choices we have, or the more difficult the decision, the more likely we are to choose the status quo. We frequently prefer the default option. When we are faced with distant threats or potential future problems, it often seems easier to do nothing. When dealing with others, we should keep in mind that they will often choose the default option. When dealing with ourselves, we should recognize our tendency not to act. And we must also realize that not acting is itself a choice with its own set of consequences. Number 11, tendency of impatience. The CEO had to make some tough decisions. If he wanted a good bonus, he needed to cut spending. He opted to drastically cut the research and development budget in favor of short-term rewards. After all, he might not even be with the company by the time the research paid off. We have a tendency to choose immediate rewards over longer-term payoffs, even when the longer-term reward may be higher or better. We may buy things with our credit card that we may not even really be able to afford because we don't have to pay them off until later. The future is seen as less certain, so people often opt for the immediate result. It can be helpful to recognize that it is not always best to choose the path of least resistance. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary. We pay today so that we can play tomorrow. Number 12, envy or jealousy tendency. In earlier hunter-gatherer society, it may be probable that evolution used this tendency to further the individual's chances of survival. A primitive early human living in an era of scarce and difficult to obtain food suddenly sees someone else with a piece of food and instantly desires it for themselves. And then perhaps we have the beginnings of a tendency towards broader envy or jealousy after it is repeated over and over for generations into modern times, along with the survival potential it confers. It has been stated that how happy we are often depends on how we stand in relation to similar others. The German philosopher Schopenhauer quoted Hobbes as saying that all mental pleasure consists in being able to compare oneself with others to one's own advantage. And Warren Buffett has often said, "It is not greed that drives the world, but envy." We need to be aware of the tendency to be envious or jealous of others, especially towards those we see as similar to ourselves. Likewise, we would do well to understand that others will sometimes be envious of us, especially when they're in similar situations and circumstances as our own. Number 13, compare, contrast, and anchoring misreaction tendency. Jack went to the car dealership to purchase a new car. The car he chose was $50,000. And when it came time to consider extra add-ons, like massaging seats for $1,000 and remote start for $500, he didn't even bat an eye. After all, they sure seemed like a bargain in comparison to the price of the car itself. And the car itself was even a bargain because the dealer had originally asked $75,000. We have a tendency to act similarly to a frog being slowly boiled to death. The story says that if you put a frog in a pot with a little room temperature water in it, and then slowly raise the temperature of the water until it is boiling, the frog ends up sitting there and getting boiled to death. We, like the frog, may end up taking many small steps towards disaster and not even notice it until it is too late, because each small step is such a small contrast to the next. This tendency is such that it can lead us to preferring a bad choice because it is compared with a really bad choice. Or we may even decline a good opportunity because it is juxtaposed with a fantastic possibility. This overall tendency also applies in situations where our mind gets anchored to a value that then affects preceding estimations of a fair value. An example being where a car dealer originally asked for $75,000 and lets the price get negotiated down to $50,000 so that the customer believes they got a great deal. Beware of the first value or price being offered or listed. It may anchor your thinking and potentially bias your judgment. We should also aim to be aware when making decisions where we compare one option with another, or even when making a choice we consider good. The question then is, good in comparison to what, and is that comparison truly representative of the big picture? Number 14, vivid or recent availability bias. Joe attended a talk on the opportunity of flipping houses in real estate for building long-term wealth. The next day, his nephew happened to ask him how he could best grow his finances. Joe instantly mentioned that flipping houses could be a great opportunity, although he had never done so himself. It was the idea that came to him most readily. Vivid emotional examples influence us more than vague statistics, and what was recently in our minds is more easily recalled as an idea for future conceptions. That which is recent is more available to our conscious minds, and especially when it involves our short-term memory. Vividness is also a quality that lends itself to memories that are more easily recalled, and if something is easily recalled, it may be more available to the thinking mind as it searches for solutions. The media is a good example of vivid and emotional stories entering our awareness, such as reports of shark attacks that instantly come to mind when we step into the water. The stories of shark attacks being one of the more available topics that the mind thinks of when swimming in the ocean, due to the many stories and movies that have been made, even though statistically it should not be as concerning. It can be helpful to observe our thinking and pay attention to where our ideas come from, and whether we think something just because we recently encountered it in some manner. A vivid and emotional story isn't necessarily more true than other accounts, and we should always seek the actual facts or statistics underlying the issue. Number 15, unavailability bias. A stock market analyst was going deep into company XYZ's financial statements and their projected profits while writing his recommendation. He analyzed all the numbers he could find related to the company's operations, just like he had done for many other companies in the past, and concluded that the company was an exceptional value and felt confident in recommending it as a buy. He was so focused on what typically was analyzed in these situations and what was available to him when he considered his analysis that he didn't even consider some newly published research fueling a growing grassroots movement that would turn out to be catastrophic to the company's future profits. When our thinking is influenced by what comes to mind easily, we consider it to be vivid or recent availability bias. The opposite is also a form of bias. We can be biased in our thinking by what does not come to mind when we consider an issue. Our thinking can be influenced by information that gets omitted. Missing information often does not draw our attention. We also have a tendency to react more to the specific or what we have names for rather than the abstract. We often don't even notice what doesn't get reported and instead focus on other details. An example would be when reading through a contract to decide if it is fair. We may focus on the details of the contract, but not even consider some important points that may be completely left out, which is why we often consult with lawyers on such matters. We need to consider if there is any missing information. We need to be aware that we may be overlooking probable threats while at the same time over-preparing for threats that come more easily to mind. This concludes part 1 of the 30 Cognitive Biases and Psychological Misjudgments production. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you